So the breaking news tonight is that Buckingham Palace has finally confirmed what half of London has been whispering about for weeks: King Charles stepping back from his public duties, and the power inside the palace is shifting to Prince William and Catherine. But that's not the part that has everyone talking. The real story is the handwritten sentence buried at the bottom of the 6th session order, a sentence that effectively shut Camilla out of the monarchy's decision-making process completely. And from what we're hearing, she didn't see it coming until the document was already signed and sealed. If you've been following the royal family, you know that Charles has been trying to project this image of stability for months. We saw the carefully staged photos of them working at his desk, the statements insisting that he was keeping up with his red boxes, the assurances that his cancer treatment wasn't slowing them down. But behind the scenes, the reality was very different. Meetings were cancelled, ceremonies were shortened, and Prince William was quietly absorbing more of the king's public schedule. What we're learning now is that the breaking point happened during a rehearsal for state ceremony in London. Charles showed up determined to get through it, but witnesses say he physically couldn't keep up. The color drained from his face, his answers got shorter, his focus drifted. Eventually the room had to be cleared and his doctors were called. A mess. Judge was blunt: if he didn't stop pushing himself, he was going to undo all the progress he'd made. He needed to surrender most of his responsibilities immediately and prepare for a longer absence than anyone had publicly admitted. That led to an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small group of constitute tunnel advisors were summoned without explanation. Before we get into what happened in that room, I have to ask you a quick question. Are you happy that Charles chose William and Catherine over Camilla? Let me know in the comments below. And if you think Camilla has held on to palace influence for way too long, do not just watch this story and silence, like this video and subscribe to our channel Crown Watch so you don't miss what happens next, because this is far from over. So there was sitting around this table and there's a sealed folder in the center. The title is simple: The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. At first, William assumes it's just about a few cancelled engagements. Catherine thinks it's a temporary adjustment, but then Charles opens the document and explains what it actually does. It transfers state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term direction of the monarchy directly to William, and then he turns to Catherine. Under this order, she would assume responsible. It is normally expected of the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, the royal household's public program, basically the visible duties that tell Britain and the Commonwealth who actually at the center of royal life. Now Catherine didn't respond right away, and honestly I get it. Accepting a role like that changes how every single future appearance is interpreted. It's one thing to support your husband, it's another to step into a position that makes you look like you're already the queen and waiting. William pushed back. He told Charles that people might think he forced this transition, that it would look like ambition rather than the necessity, but Charles was clear. He said the decision was his, and that protecting the monarchy couldn't mean pretending his strength hadn't changed. He was trying to shield them from the blame. But here's where it gets weird. Before the meeting continued, Princess Anne placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of Camilla, his house. All these were just casual emails. They were plans for how Camilla could preserve her authority if Charles withdrew, how her office could retain influence over ceremonies, appointments, and the palace program, how William's control could be treated as temporary even if Charles remained away for months. William read the first page twice. Catherine stayed completely still. The implications were impossible to ignore. While Charles was struggling to maintain his duties, Camilla household was already discussing how to keep her in our hands, and neither William nor Catherine had been invited into those conversations. Charles hadn't approved them and have found that before the plan could go any further. The language in those notes was careful. Nothing sounded openly rebellious. Nobody used the word power, but every single line pointed in the same direction. Camilla's office had been preparing for Charles's absence before William was even told how serious that absence might become. The proposal described in it vice rearrangement based at Clarence House. It would allow Camilla his offers to review ceremonial plans, recommend changes to the royal diary, and stay involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph actually suggested that William's expanded authority should be described as temporary, even if Charles stayed away from months. That sentence changed the entire room. Where he amassed who wrote it and turned to another page and pointed to a list of names: senior members of Camilla, his office, private secretaries, household advisors. Charles read the names in silence. He hadn't approved the meeting, he hadn't requested the proposal, and he definitely hadn't been told that his wife's household was already discussing how to preserve influence. After he stepped back, Catherine's attention moved to the margins of the document. There were handwritten comments next to the proposals. One recommended that major ceremonial decisions should require consultation with the Queen's office. Another warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the only center of authority during the King's recovery. The message underneath all that polite wording was unmistakable: William could carry the burden, but Camilla intended to keep a hand on the controls, and explained that the papers had reached her after a senior. It became an easy. The concern was framed as continuity, stability, experience. Palace language can make almost everything sounds harmless, but Charles closed the folder and asked the question everyone was thinking: that Camilla know about this? And said the discussions had taken place through her household, but the documents didn't show Oh, how much she had personally approved. William looked towards the door, ready to confront her. Right there, Charles stopped him. He said this couldn't become a corridor confrontation, not with staff moving through the palace and reporters watching every change in the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned privately and given a chance to explain. The meeting broke for 20 minutes. William walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens. His anger hadn't gone away. That settled into something colder. Catherine followed him and reminded him that the papers were dangerous because they looked reasonable. A public accusation would allow Camilla his office to deny everything and paint William as impatient for the crown. He understood that made it worse. When Camilla finally entered the room, Charles was seated at the head of the table and kept the folder closed. William stood near the fireplace. Catherine sat directly opposite the chair prepared for Camilla. Nobody raised their voice. The silence did enough. Charles asked her directly, were her household had discussed an advisory council operating from classes after his withdrawal. Camilla paused and said responsible staff had considered several possibilities. She described it as preparation, not ambition. She argued that a monarchy facing uncertainty couldn't afford to discard experience. She had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure. She understood the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, the personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision wouldn't create stability, would create disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. She proposed a formal position allowing her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronage, and the public program. William would manage constitutional business. Catherine could represent the crown beside him, but Camilla household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interest were concerned. It sounded like compromise. It wasn't. Catherine asked one question: who would make the final decision? When William and Camilla disagreed, Camilla answered that Charles's wishes should guide them, but that was the problem. Charles's absence was the or reason this arrangement existed, yet Camilla's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would come back through calls, competing instructions, and appeals for intervention. And opened the folder and slid one page toward Charles. It described William's authority as reversible. That word ended the discussion. Charles told Camilla that no amendment would be made that created the second quarter or weakened the year's authority. Camilla, his expression changed. She turned to William and asked if this was what he wanted. William answered that he hadn't written the order, Charles had. Camilla left without accepting that decision. The dorks softly behind her, but nobody mistook calm for surrender. Charles then, as the constitutional advisor, the question everyone had been avoiding: could Camilla household challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor looked at the final page and said there was one way to make sure they never. Could you explain that a transfer of duties could be challenged through interpretation? A household might claim consultation rights and aid, might delay an appointment. A disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those moves would overturn William's authority, but each could slow it, weaken it, and force the king back into the struggle he was trying to escape. Trials on the wood. This was no longer about whether William could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct him while pretending to protect the crown. William moved away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. He told Charles that he wouldn't accept authority built on public humiliation. He wouldn't appear before the country as though illness had become an opportunity. If the announcement went forward, it had to preserve the king's dignity. Charles nodded. Stepping aside wasn't surrender. He said it was a choice made before weakness allowed others to choose from. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented. Our concern was clarity. The country couldn't be shown one arrangement while the palace operated under another. If William was expected to lead the public program, had to reflect it. If Catherine was expected to assume the queen's visible duties, no private office could quietly revise her decisions and watch Charles closely. He had spent years balancing affection, duty, history, and guilt. Now every compromise led back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing beside him. Way of needed unquestioned authority as heir. Catherine needed protection from accusations that she had taken something not hers. The monarchy needed one voice. Only one of those needs could govern the water. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the queen's household were removed. State audiences would pass directly to William. Senior palace appointments would require approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the royal household, and would remain the bridge, not the ruler. About the rival, the witness. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than expected. The answers became less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement couldn't remain temporary forever, simply because no one wished to name what came next. The crowd couldn't live inside applause. Charles reached the final page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected of him to sign. Catherine expected another delay, and noticed his hand move away from the signature and toward the blank space below the last clause. He began to write slowly. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the queen's household. That one sentence changed everything. William read it once, that again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement, was a barrier. Charles hadn't merely transferred responsibility to his son, he had blocked the office, most likely to contest how that responsibility would be used. Catherine looked toward an endgame. No sign of surprise. But her stillness revealed that she understood the scale of what had happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. That mattered. Type language could be blamed on advisors. Legal phrasing could be described as routine. A handwritten sentence from the king could not be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Charles signed beneath the sentence and signed as witness. Way placed his hand on the document, but didn't pick it up for a few seconds. Father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, aware that the paper between them had changed more than the royal diary. It had changed the center of power. A secretary anthem could seal the copies and ask where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation, Clarence House. Camilla received it before the announcement was even drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace had ended. The fight over. Or what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff expected anger. What they saw instead was control. She placed the copied order on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten. Since no one spoke the words where to direct, they left no space for negotiation. No quiet route back in a palace decisions, and no chance to claim that William's authority remained dependent on her approval. Camilla asked whether the sense could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor answered carefully. The king had written it himself. The seal had been applied and had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require trials to reopen the order. Camilla understood the problem. Charles had closed the door before she could reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she appeared beside him anyway. A united image might preserve influence that the document had removed. Camilla rejected the idea. Standing beneath palace cameras while William and Catherine were presented as the new center of the monarchy would look like consent. Worse, it would make her a witness to her own exclusion. She would not give them that picture. Across London, Buckingham Palace moved with unusual speed. Communications officers drafted the statement. Ceremonial staff measured positions in the throne room. Security team revised arrival plans. Government representatives in Westminster received restricted notice that the king would address the country regarding the future conduct of royal duties. The language was chosen with care. Charles was that abdicating William was not being crowned. Catherine was not being declared queen yet. Every practice full detail pointed toward the same reality. Authority was moving. Public responsibility was moving. The visible way to the crown was moving with it. The palace statement would call it continuity. The room would call it succession. Charles insisted on appearing first. Advisors wanted a written announcement released through official channels, but he refused to let illness speak for him. He would look into the cameras, explain the decision, and make clear that William had not demanded it. That mattered to him more than anyone realized. We had spent years preparing to inherit the crown, but preparation was not desired. Charles, though, how quickly the public could turn duty into ambition. One photograph of William near the throne, one poorly chosen phrase, one suggestion that Catherine looked too comfortable, and the transition could be recast as a family takeover so Charles would carry the blame. He approved a short address stating that his recovery required a reduction in duties. He would confirm that was assuming responsibility for state audiences, senior appointments, and strategic planning. He would name Catherine as the person overseeing major ceremonial functions and the household's public program. Then he added a line: the advisors had not prepared the future, must not wait for pride to admit what duty already knows. No one asked them to read. Move it. At Clarence House, Camilla received the final schedule. Her arrival time had been left. Like a place remained available near Charles during the opening statement, but no role had been assigned to her afterward. She could attend as his wife. She could not participate as a decision maker. The distinction cut deeper than any public insult. Camilla sent one final message to Buckingham Palace. She asked where the trials would reconsider the restriction on her household if she appeared beside him. The reply came 20 minutes later. The order stood as signed. Camilla canceled her car outside Buckingham Palace. Broadcasters began live coverage. Crowds gathered beyond the gates. Newsrooms across the United Kingdom cleared their schedules. The first images showed senior officials entering through a side entrance, followed by, and then William and Catherine. Camilla was missing. Rumors spread immediately. Some claimed illness, others suggested a private disagreement. Palace official repeated the same phrase, a family matter. Inside, Charles waited in a private room with the original order beside him. William arrived first. Catherine followed and stood by the window watching the courtyard below fill with cameras. Charles looked tired, but his voice remained steady. He told William that the sprint would change the public understanding of their relationship. From that moment, every decision would be examined for signs of conflict. Every absence would become a theory. Every appearance would be treated as a declaration. William answered that he would honor the reign already in progress. Catherine said nothing. She was looking at the to-say ceremonial chairs beyond the open doors. One bore William's place, the other bought hers. A palace aide entered and confirmed that Camilla would not attend. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then gave the order to begin. The cameras went live. The palace doors opened, and before Charles spoke a single word, Britain saw who had chosen to stand beside the future and who had chosen to stay away. Charles eyed the prepared room alone. For several seconds he stood behind the lectern without speaking. The cameras had found the strain around his eyes. No palace statement could hide it. He looked determined, but the effort required to remain there was visible. Then he began. He told the country that duties sometimes demanded a person recognize the difference between endurance and service. Continuing at any cost, he said, would not protect the monarchy. It would expose it to uncertainty. His recovery required distance from the daily weight of the crown, and the institution required leadership. I could act without hesitation. He named William. The words were measured, but their meaning traveled through London, Westminster, and newsrooms. Following the address, William would assume responsibility for state audiences, senior palace appointments, and the long-range direction of the royal household. The arrangement would begin immediately. Then charge. Named Catherine, she would oversee state banquets, diplomatic reception, ceremonial presentation, and the public program attached to the crown. Her role would not be decorative. She would stand beside William whenever the monarchy needed to show the country who now carried its public burden. The room remained silent. Charles did not mention Camilla. That omission struck harder than any criticism could have done. He thanked those who had supported him during his treatment. He spoke of continuity, family, in the future. But the woman who had stood beside him through his reign was absent from both the room and the transfer of authority. And Clarence House. Camilla watched the edge. Russ with to staff members. She did not speak when William's name was announced. She did not move when Catherine's new responsibilities were listed. Only when Charles finished, without naming any continuing role for her, did she reach for the copy of the wood or again the handwritten sentence. Weighted near the royal seal. Nothing had changed. Back at Buckingham Palace, Charles stepped away from the lectern. William entered through the side doors. He did not smile. He approached his father, bowed his head, and promised to honor the reign Charles had begun. The moment was carefully controlled. The emotion was not trust. Place one hand on William's arm and released it quickly, as though holding on longer might reveal too much. Catherine joined them a few steps later. She wore no crown, no tiara, and no symbol suggesting celebration. Her expression carried the weight of the decision more than any speech. And watched from the edge of the room. She had seen constitutional moments presented as pageantry before. This was different. There were no cheers inside the palace, no music, no sense of victory, only a family trying to turn a private collapse in confidence into a public image of order. Then Charles left. Cameras remained William and Kate. Catherine turned toward the throne room where the two ceremonial chairs had been positioned beneath the royal insignia. They began walking together slowly enough for every broadcaster to capture the image. Of course, the United Kingdom. The symbolism was immediate. This was not a coronation, but it looked like the beginning of something that cannot easily be reversed. William stopped before the first year. Catherine stood beside the second. Neither sat at once. For one suspended moment, they remained standing, aware that the country was watching them inherit responsibility before it inherited a new monarch. Then William took his place. Catherine followed. The pictures spread across television screens and phones. Within minutes, commentators debated whether the palace had crossed an invisible constitutional line. Supporters described it as necessary stability. Critics questioned how temporary the transfer could be when the ceremony had been designed to present William and Catherine as the monarchy. His next center. One question dominated every broadcast. Where was Camilla? Palace officials repeated that her absence concerned a private family matter. The phrase satisfied no one. Reporters outside Buckingham Palace had already learned that her car had been cancelled before the address. Others discovered that no future ceremonial role for her appeared in the public briefing. The explanation began to unravel inside Clarence House. Camilla ordered the television switched off. She had expected Charles to reduce his schedule. She had not expected him to make William's authority visible in front of the world. She had certainly not expected Catherine to assume duties Camilla believed should remain attached to her position. Her title had not been removed. Her influence had. After the cameras left, a private secretary handed way in the signed water rather than the public copy. He examined the final page and noticed something he had missed during the meeting. Charles had placed the handwritten risk direction directly above the royal seal. Anyone attempting to challenge William but have to pass that sense before reaching the king's signature. It was not an afterthought. It was the point. William carried the original order into a smaller audience room after the cameras had gone. The noise outside Buckingham Palace continued, but inside the building felt emptied of ceremony. Charles was waiting at the window. Catherine stood beside a table covered with briefing papers and remained by the door holding the second seal folder. No one had yet discussed. William placed the order before his father. He asked one question. Was the handwritten restriction truly necessary? Charles did not answer at once. He looked at the sentence above the seal, the one line that had transformed the medical arrangement into a boundary. Then he admitted what the public statement had left and said. His doctors had forced him to reduce the workload. Camilla, his private preparations had forced him to decide wherewith already ended with that sentence. Every decision could have become a negotiation. An appointment made by William could have been questioned. A Clarence House estate banquet planned by Catherine could have been revised through private messages. A ceremonial invitation could have been delayed until Charles intervened. The king would have stepped away in public. Walk and 10. The way to settle disputes in private. That was not recovery. That was another form of captivity. Charles told him that he had spent too many years believing personal loyalty could be balanced against institutional clarity. This time there could be no blurred line, no rival office, no second quarter operating through friendship, access, or habit. William listened without interrupting. The anger he had carried earlier began to change. His father had not written the restriction to embarrass Camilla. He had written it because he knew how quickly uncertainty could become control. Catherine understood the cost more quietly. Charles had protected their authority, but in doing so he had exposed the fracture. or inside his own household. The public would see a careful transition. The family would remember the argument behind it and finally move from the door. She said the sentence would be studied for years because it revealed the moment Charles stopped trying to satisfy everyone as king. He had chosen one line of command as a husband here. Accepted the consequence. At Clarence's house, Camilla was reaching the same conclusion. Her title remained, her staff remained, her rooms, engagements, and private charities remained, yet the machinery that gave those things influence had shifted away from her. Decisions would now leave William's office. Ceremonial instructions would carry Catherine's approval. The appeals that Charles would no longer reopen what had been settled. Camilla had not lost everything. She had lost the part that mattered most, the ability to shape what happened next. By evening, the image of William and Catherine beneath the royal insignia had traveled across Britain. Supporters call that stability, critics call that a soft truth. As for palace officials, refused both descriptions. They repeated that Charles remained king and that the arrangement protected continuity, but symbols speak when statements refused. 2 chairs had been prepared, 2 names had been announced, 1 household had been excluded. Charles asked William for one final promise: that transition and must not become a campaign against Camilla. No public retaliation, no deliberate humiliation, no attempt to erase her from his reign. William agreed, but the promise carried a limit. Respect would not mean surrendering authority. Catherine supported that line. Camilla would be treated with dignity, but she would not be permitted to reopen decisions through private pressure. That was the settlement, cold, clear, final, and then placed the second sealed folder on the table. Charles looked at it and asked whether it could wait and said it could not. The cover carried a short title: Queen's Household Privileges and Residences. After the transition, inside were instructions concerning staff access, ceremonial invitations, and the royal properties Camilla could continue using or Charles remained away from public life. One page concerned Clarence's house, another concerned Buckingham Palace, but the final page carried a handwritten note beside Camilla. His name. It identified the exact date her unrestricted palace access could, and it had been approved before the throne room announcement began. Camilla had not seen at WM. Had not seen it, and when it opened that final page, even Charles appeared unprepared for what had already been authorized. The decision carried a deadline measured not in years, but in days. That document and the single residence Camilla could be ordered to leave first is where the next story begins.